Okay, we are now live. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. This is a somewhat sort of experimental meeting. This is the first time we've done a general meeting about the Wilson Grants for parents. And when I say experimental, by that I mean I'm going to talk through some of the background, some of the application process, and cover what I think of as being sort of the big issues with the Wilson Grants, and then open it up to questions. And hopefully it will cover the information that's relevant. I will admit that the movie connoisseur in me had a slightly different title that I wanted to use for this presentation about what I'm going to go through. And when I say almost everything, that's because some of the things I will be needing to respond to your questions to know what kind of things we should include in future presentations. So I hope to cover everything that's useful. I hope to be able to answer every question you have afterwards. I just ask for preemptive indulgence that sometimes the answer to that question may be, this is the person you need to talk to help answer that question. So I plan to talk for about 10-15 minutes and then open it up for questions. The handout that is on the table outside is basically a printed version of what I sent around earlier this week, just an overview of the Wilson Grants program, and it will sort of form the basis of what I'm talking about today. So first thing is just to clear up some potential confusions or overlaps between some of the programs that MBA offers, the difference between the Wilson Grants, which is what we're talking about this evening, and the international exchanges. So Wilson Grants are administered through my office and the department chairs. They're open to grades 7 through 11, so current 7th through 11th grades, though this evening we'll talk just about the high school. And the exchanges are administered by Mrs. Scholler and Mr. Joya, and for 11th grade only. Those are also great programs. They're well worth applying for. They're often conflated at the school. They are two separate ones. Also important to stress, if you go on one of these, it doesn't mean you cannot go on the other. So these are two separate programs, exchanges and grants, separate issues. If you are interested, there is a brown bag lunch tomorrow at noon in the innovation room about the exchanges, but otherwise Mrs. Scholler would be the person to contact. And I say it gets confusing because some of the Wilson Grants do involve travel overseas, and the exchanges obviously involve travel overseas, and some of them are language programs, and the exchanges are often associated with language programs, so it all gets a little bit fuzzy. One general rule of thumb is if your child goes on one of these grants, if they bring someone back with them, that was an exchange. If they come back by themselves, it was probably a Wilson Grant or something has gone horribly wrong. But just to separate the distinction between the two. So the Wilson Grants, by contrast, there's a couple of programs, and there's going to be a lot of information up here in a moment, trying to strike that balance between giving enough information and overloading with it. The good news is 5 things are going to appear up here, only 2 of them are directly relevant. But just to give you the big overview. So programs funded by the Wilson Grants, the main one, the biggest one that is, are the language grants. And these are based around set travel or immersion programs. So the language department has a series of travel and immersion programs that it sends students to, and the grants themselves are administered entirely by Daniel Paoliki, who is the chair of the languages department. Last year, to put that in some perspective, or in general, the last few years, nearly $300,000 spent on them. About 55 boys every year go on those. So we're going to talk about those. Second category are departmental grants. These are administered by the other department chairs, the other 5 department chairs. These are a combination of pre-approved programs. That basically means programs we've sent people on before. So if that program has been sponsored before, that means it's eligible to be sponsored again. But also what I call self-research programs. That is, if a boy comes to us and says, I'd love to do a grant for science, this program wasn't on the previous list, but I think it's a great program, and I think it fits the mission of the Wilson Grants, that's great. There is no problem with that at all. So that's what I mean by sort of self-research programs. Each department spends about $37,000, and that in total amounts to 75 boys a year. The obvious discrepancy there being that the language grants, the travel costs are much higher. That's why the amount is spent is more, even though it's fewer boys. These are the 2 main ones that we're going to talk about tonight. Some other Wilson programs, and I'm mentioning these mostly just to put them to one side so that they don't cause confusion about the larger programs. There is a new one this year, which will be a cultural history trip to Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The fact that it's new both makes it very exciting and also means that the details of it are not as ironed out as they are for the older programs. It's Jim Womack of the Arts Department who is planning this trip. It'll be about 10 boys who get to go on it. Probably will be restricted to upperclassmen only, but he will circulate information about that in November. The applications will be due at the end of this semester. So again, there's plenty of time on this. I'm flagging this up now. This is a Wilson program, but it's a newer one. Two others that often cause some confusion: Wilson summer classes. These are offered on campus through June, July, and August, and on the handout you actually have at the back a list of the classes that were offered last year. These tend to be 1 or 2 week classes. They are funded by the Wilson Grants, administered by Jim Leck on campus, but there is no charge for attending these. There's no cost to attending these, and you don't really apply for these so much as you register for them. So these summer programs, Dr. Leck will send some information out in the spring. Any MBA student is welcome to sign up for them. It isn't really an application process in the same way as the grants, but it is also Wilson money. And finally, there's the debate program. The debate program gets a small amount of money each year from the Wilsons, which is intended to be sort of financial aid to help boys attend summer debate camps if they might otherwise financially have difficulty doing so. It's about $15,000, covers about 10 boys every year, and these decisions are also made in the spring. So if we're thinking about the Wilson grants as going into several pots of money, the two biggest pots of money are at the top there, language grants, department grants. Those are the ones that are relevant this evening. If you hear stuff about these other programs, they are also Wilson programs, but they operate differently and separately. So let's give a quick overview for these different grants. Who is eligible? If we're talking about language grants, any current 9th, 10th, or 11th grader who's enrolled in a language class and intends to continue in that class the following year is eligible. So it can be someone in Spanish 1, it can be someone in French 3, it can be someone in Latin 2, it can be any language class. The only criteria is if you accept the Wilson grant, you are committing to take that language the following year as well. And that's honestly the original purpose behind these grants, was to further and expand the language program. So they set as a condition, if you go on one, you are expected to come back and continue with your language studies. So that's the eligibility for that one, but that's all it is. The criteria is no more complicated than that. Current 9th, 10th, 11th graders enrolled in a language class. The other departments, it's even a little more open than that. Any current student who will be in the high school next year who's in good academic standing in that department, and I use a slightly vague phrase there because we don't want to make it directly correlated to someone's grade. Equally, it's not a good idea if for whatever reason someone failed a class or made a 70 in a class to expect that the Wilson grant will necessarily go to them in that department. So it doesn't mean you need a 98, it doesn't even mean you need a grade in the 90s. As long as you have shown an interest in that subject and your teacher is able to say, this student has an interest in this subject and has a drive and energy for it that would be benefited by a Wilson grant. That's all it takes. It doesn't even commit you to taking that class the next year. It doesn't commit you to any academic choices over the following years. Deadlines. This year we have pared it down. You will be hopefully glad to know, there were 6 separate deadlines last year. We have decided to make 2 deadlines, and there have to be 2, and I'll explain that in just a moment. For the language programs, the application deadline is November 27th. For all other departmental programs, it is January 12th. And the basic reason for doing that is that, and I'll explain in a moment how many programs you can apply for, if you accept a language program grant, you are typically going to be unable to accept any other grant. The people making decisions about those other grants need to know who is getting the language grants before they make their decisions. There's no point in offering money to someone who can't take it. The language grants are the biggest program. They are the most time committed, involve the biggest time commitment, so they will go first, but it's just 2 deadlines to keep in mind for the main programs. And January 12th, that's designed to give students a little chance over winter break to still work on, if they want to fine-tune their applications or anything else, ask questions about it without the pressure of exams. Yes? That's for the cultural history trip. So that's a separate, I'm putting that into a separate bucket at the moment. But yes, that's a middle ground one. Okay, the application process itself is mostly done now online. When I say mostly, the formal side of it is all done online. The informal side of it, which I strongly encourage you to talk to your sons about, is teachers talking to students or students talking to teachers to express their interest and to talk about what programs they might be interested in. So that's the kind of, this would be a great, when they come back from fall break, would be a great time to start doing that, exploring what might they be interested in. But when it comes to the formal part of it, it is all done online, and it is hopefully, we try to make it as simple as possible. If you're on the MBA website, you go to academics, you go to Wilson Grants, and you will see this page appear, a short paragraph explaining the origins of it, and then whichever grant you are interested in applying for, you click on that and that will take you to the application form. You will also see there a list of programs that people have previously been on, which can be a useful guide, either because you see one that says, that's the one I want to go on, or if you're trying to figure out, does this other one that I'm looking at fit in with what the Wilson programs generally are? Yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. At some point during this year, the website is going to undergo a transition. From the Wilson Grant standpoint, it won't be especially dramatic. It will simply mean that the part at the bottom of the website there will be replaced with this, which ideally will have the documents more easily accessible. You can tell this is very much in the beta stage still, as visual and perform in arts have yet to have their spelling correctly entered, but this is at some point going to replace that bottom section of the page. But hopefully it's still, basically the idea is whichever one you're interested in, you can get to the information very quickly. A couple of FAQs, and I realize there are probably plenty more questions. Common misconception: you can apply for more than one type of grant per year. You could, if you wanted to, apply to a language grant and all other 5 departments in the same year. You cannot generally accept 2 grants in the same year. And here, this is one of those moments where I have to enter a caveat, because the Wilson grants are varied enough that we have to sort of say there's general rules, there might sometimes be an exception. An example of an exception might be if someone applies for 2 one-week programs in town that both cost about $500, we might well say, you know what, we're happy for you to do both of these. Or we might say, there's one short additional one that you're doing, but it's a particularly valuable one to you, we might consider allowing you to do it. So I say this as a general rule: apply for as many as the boys want to apply for. They can always choose which ones they accept, but be ready to be told if they do get more than one, you need to choose which one you want to take. In the departmental grants, yes, you can propose your own course of study. This is coming back to that sort of self-researched programs. The basic goal should be it has to correspond in some way with the MBA academic curriculum. The most common one that boys ask if they can apply for, and we have to unfortunately tell them no, is things like sports management, which they are very interested in, and it's a perfectly great thing to be studying, but it doesn't fit with any part of the academic curriculum at MBA, so the Wilson grant wouldn't even be clear which department necessarily that would be associated with. So the only criteria is that the program be associated with some element of MBA's curriculum and be an accredited program of some kind. But they are very welcome to suggest it, and they are absolutely welcome to ask before they apply, if I put this program down, would it be eligible? And that would be an important question to ask. If the program is listed as having been attended before, you don't need to worry about that question. If they found their own one, great. It never hurts to check first, would this one be eligible if I applied for it? Final thing on that, and then I have just, I think, one more slide after this. What we want to get as much information out about the Wilson grants as possible, because they are fantastic programs. The risk always is that the more information you put out, the applications go up, which is great. It also means that the grants, there's more pressure on them to cover more people. If it should happen that any one grant, languages or any of the department grants, are oversubscribed, and by oversubscribed I mean there are more applications that we would like to give money to than we have money to give, what kind of criteria might we use? One of them might be, has the student previously received a grant from that department? If so, we might favor someone who hasn't yet had one. Have they received an international exchange through MBA that year? It's not impossible to have two. If we are really facing a crunch on the question of giving one boy a Wilson grant and an exchange, or giving one boy an exchange and one boy a Wilson grant, we might say we're going to spread it out and have as many boys go on programs as possible rather than have one go on several. And finally, we will sometimes give preference to if it's an upperclassman who hasn't previously received any kind of Wilson grant or international exchange. So if, for example, it's a toss-up between a sophomore who went on a Wilson grant last year and a rising senior who hasn't gone on a grant or an exchange, but they're sort of equally strong applications and only one bit of money left, we might favor the upperclassman because we assume the sophomore would have another opportunity and had already received something as well beforehand. But again, questions about how each department does this, they do it slightly differently, the department chairs would be able to help you. Finally, just some general sort of information. This is the 2017 grants. Again, it's hard to put in sort of definitive rules about this, but if you're thinking about, well, how much of this cost can I expect the grants to cover, the short answer is these sort of three benchmarks. If it's a grant of less than $1,500, we tend to award it in full. There are occasional exceptions to that. Often that exception is itself, like someone has received something else, we can give them a little bit of help for another grant, but we don't want to give them two full pieces of funding. If it's about $1,500 to $2,500, it'll tend to be about 80 to 100% coverage of the program costs. And above $2,500, it may get to the point where departments will say, well, we can give you a proportion of the costs, but this program is too expensive for us to be able to pay it, because if we do that, then we are cutting down on the amount of grants we can give to other people. So, for example, there are students, if they're applying for long-term, like 3 or 4 week-long programs at very prestigious institutions, those can run to $4,000 or $5,000. And if we did that, if we gave that in full every time, there would be almost nothing. You'd end up with 5 or 6 boys going in each department at most. Final bit of information that might be helpful, just to show you again, the grants really are spread out through the high school. The math department is the only one that gives high school grants to rising 9th graders. That's in part because they would consider some of the geometry honors and algebra 1 honors students to be sort of advanced high school as well. But it doesn't happen very often. Most of it is 9th, 10th, and 11th, and honestly, it's fairly evenly distributed. So you can see from these numbers, the 10th grade does get the most of them, but it's the 11th grade that gets most of the departmental ones. One of the reasons the 11th grade doesn't get as many is that those are the boys going on exchange as well, so they're not included here. But you can see sort of fairly well distributed, but as you go up through the years, the boys tend to get more of the departmental grants. So that was my kind of overview. Now open it up to any questions people have, either about things that were on the slides that you would want more clarification on, things that were in the packet that you'd want more clarification on, or things that weren't included in either one that you would like more clarification on. Yeah. Okay, so sorry, just for the sake of the camera, so the question is, what is the length of time on the language programs? What time of year do they tend to happen? It tends to be at least 3 to 4 weeks. Depends exactly on the language in question. It tends to be up at Middlebury, but it's spread through June and July. That would be, the languages chair would be able to tell you specifically which language would go when. But you should be reckoning with around a 3 to 4 week time. Sorry, immersion before exchange or immersion before travel? It's because if you're exchange to another school, sort of the New Zealand travel, yes. If you have, well, the one possible exception to that might be if you've entered the high school as an 11th grader, let's say, and you only have one summer left to do something, you then might be allowed to do it. Otherwise, the immersion program, you have to be on that first. It should also be added just generally that if you get on an immersion program, you are kind of, not to sound like a marketing scam, but you are pre-qualified for the travel program the next year. The idea is that you will be able to go on that as well. There is, well, yes and no. There is an intensive Latin program that exists. Honestly, though, they would accept Italian as, people will sometimes do an Italian course instead. And it doesn't have it doesn't really have the travel program in the way that the other languages do. Really, it's the junior school Latin trip is the one that's supposed to be kind of available to them for that. So the question is, are the applications for languages and the individual departments at the same time? The language deadline is first, but you can have applications in to the other departments at the same time. You could wait a few more weeks and then submit them. There's no restriction on when those happen or if they're simultaneous or one after the other. Our next question was, when does it open? So the language department section of the website is already live and it can be accessed. I think Senor Paoliki will send information around saying, please start your applications. All the websites should be live after fall break. So the information on all departments should be up to date by the end of fall break. Yes. So the question is, when are the departmental grants awarded? Typically 2 to 3 weeks after the applications are received. We try and get it done by the beginning of February, in part because the boys themselves have to apply to the programs and they want the kind of surety that they are going to have some funding for that. So 2 to 3 weeks, end of January is the goal. Yeah. So the question about the cultural history trip, details, you mean like what exactly will it consist of? So the goal is to spend about 3 days and 3 nights in the major northeastern cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, visiting sort of the art galleries, museums, some of the historical sites, and then also some of the sort of more modern cultural sites in the evening. So, concerts, for example, to go to. Mr. Womack is putting the itinerary together. I've seen a draft version of it, which lists about 25 museums for every city. So it will be pared down. He's looking at that at the moment. But the idea would be, they'll visit sites in the different ones. They'll experience that city in its historical sense, its cultural sense, both past and present. And it would be about a 10-day trip, flying out to Philadelphia, I think they're going to start in, but then traveling by train between there, New York and Boston, and then flying back. Yes. And the question, when would that be? It will likely be in June, but I see people writing that down. Please don't write that down yet. Mr. Womack is looking at dates that will work best, and he is also, for example, looking at things like what concerts are being shown. He's even looking at the baseball schedule because he would like at some point to include a trip to some of the old baseball stadiums there as well. So please, he will have some details on that, I would think, in the next month or so. So where can you find a description of each of the grants? If you go to where are you? If you go to the website, any of the links, whichever one you click on, will describe, right now it'll describe who is eligible, what the application process is, what grants have been used or attended previously, and what the overall goal of the grants is supposed to be. So it should be a sort of a general description of the grants in each particular department. Is that what you meant by that?
Well, maybe more of what I can maybe, what the country for university
Oh, so is there a more precise description of the programs? So on those sites where they list those programs, it will either on the site itself have a bit of a description, or there'll be a link saying, details of the program, and you would click through there. Typically not. I think that'll be handled just by the debate coaches. That's how it's been done in previous years, and they'll tend to get to that in sort of March or April of next year. So the question is there a list of countries that, for the languages grants, for the travel grants? I'm going to go out on a limb here without being able to live click on this and say I think there is. If there is not, it's very easy to get that information to you as to which countries people have traveled to. If it were up to me, it would say England, but there's some technicality about the language basically being the same, and that doesn't qualify. But yeah, I think that information is out there, but if it's not, we can get it to you pretty easily. Let's go here and here. So the question is about when the grants overlap with summer athletic commitments. For the immersion programs, yes, and for the travel programs. For the grants that have been previously attended, typically if the dates have been set for those, they will be available through the links as you see what the list of previous grants is. It is unfortunately impossible for us to keep track of like a general calendar given all the dozens and dozens of programs, and they don't always happen at the same time. But if you are uncertain about when certain programs would be offered, the department chairs will be able to help you find that out. For the immersion programs and for the special trips like the cultural history trip, once those dates are set, those dates will be posted for comparison with athletic commitments. Okay, so the question is, are the Warner grants totally separate? So the short answer is yes. They are alphabetically close, but functionally very different. Their timeline isn't totally dissimilar. So the deadline for the Eton exchange, the deadline is October 27th. Every other exchange, the deadline is December 1st. So the application process is chronologically similar, but they are handled differently until it gets to the point sometimes where we're trying to make sure that as many boys have things as possible, and then we might weigh back and forth on that. Most of them. There are some exchanges that are not funded by the Warner grants. I think all Warner grants are exchanges, not all exchanges are Warner grants. But none of them are Wilson grants. None of them are Wilson grants. Okay, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just in case actually the camera hopefully caught that because you're right under it, but just in case, overall, there used to be just all called Warner exchanges, and there is still some support from the Warner family, but we are now, just for sake of ease, calling them international exchanges. The rogue element in the back row. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is, the math grants and most of the departmental grants are all individual, often just one person going to one program. Is it the same true for the language grants? From the perspective of the application, yes. So you apply as one student, and it doesn't matter who else gets it or doesn't get it, as to whether you get it. At the immersion programs at Middlebury, you will often be there with some other MBA students on that same language program or possibly a different language program that's operating at the same time. On some occasions on the travel, that'll be true as well. So you might find yourself traveling to the same place or being on an immersion program with some other MBA students, but it doesn't affect the application. You could be, but there's no guarantee that you will be, but you could be. In fact, with some of the immersion programs, you definitely will be. Travel programs, it's a little harder to say for sure. Mm-hmm. So the question is, when it comes to the travel programs after the immersion, do the boys themselves pitch for a certain program they want to go on, or does the language department set it? It varies a little bit by language, because Spanish, for example, there are a couple of different countries that boys have traveled to for Spanish, so Argentina, Colombia, Spain. To my knowledge, France has only been France itself, that they haven't gone to another Francophone country. They are certainly welcome to suggest another one, but it may be that in those instances the department says, these are the ones we know are good, this is the one we've worked with, this is the one that's available, and we think this is the right one. So again, it varies by, so the question is it a part of a whole trip with other students and teachers? It varies a little bit by language, and I would hesitate to speak for all of them. I'll speak for the German program. It involves 3 or 4 boys spending 3 weeks in a school in Germany and living with host families, and then for another week and a half, they travel through Germany and Austria with Herr Doherty, visiting Munich, Nuremberg, Vienna, places like that. So that's the structure there. I would not want to speak for exactly how it works in the others. I think it's similar, but the language teachers themselves would be able to tell you that. Any other questions? Mm-hmm. So will the links to the programs be available on the Language Grants website? It should be. As I said, in general, they're all supposed to be live at the end of fall break. I think the dates and information for the Language Grants has already been updated, but if that information isn't there yet, then it should be posted. Mm-hmm. So the question is, if you're interested in going to a certain program, should you wait to hear back about the Wilson Grant before you apply to it? The short answer would be, would you be willing to cover the costs if a Wilson Grant wasn't awarded? Sometimes the answer is yes, in which case apply as early as possible. In general, though, we'd say we try and get those decisions out in plenty of time, so there's no harm in waiting to hear whether or not a grant has been awarded, or in some instances, how much of a grant has been awarded. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the question is, what would be examples of programs that were added by, in a sense, added by students? I don't honestly know which specific ones. Some of these may actually have been found by students themselves and proposed to the department, or some of them may have been with the department for years. But what you suggested about searching is, I would say it's the right way to start. So, summer programs for high school students, English writing, and see what comes up. And essentially, if they're affiliated with an educational institution or a cultural institution that it would make sense that they would have this kind of program, then it's probably going to be eligible. Does that answer that? Okay. Any other questions? There is no, if you think of it, this is not the last time. We don't shut down the question process after this evening. So I would just say, if there are any others right now, the basic rule of thumb would be questions about language grants, Daniel Paoliki, questions about individual departmental grants, individual departmental chairs, overall questions about the Wilson Grant program, you can send them to me. Just be aware that my response will sometimes be, that's a great question for someone else. I actually have that as my default reply on it. But those would be the 3 main points of contact. So Daniel Paoliki for languages, department chairs for other departmental grants, overarching questions, or if you're just not sure who to ask, feel free to ask me. All right, thank you all for being here.